Okay, in this assignment, we're going to talk about light and shadow. And of course, with any photograph, light is a required part of the process, but you'll see in the images that I show you that light can really become an important part of the subject matter. And all the images that you'll see here really stress that idea that the quality of the light and how it ends up being used in the photograph can really add a lot to the emotional feeling of that image. So in the first two images that you're seeing, they're both pictures of women, and you notice that the quality of the light in the first one, there's a lattice and sun is shining through that lattice and in a sense kind of breaking up the figure that you're looking at. In the second image, it's a picture of a woman who has her hands planted on the ground and she's turned and looking at her shadow on the ground. And imagine what both of these images would look like if it was a cloudy day. The next image is maybe the most dramatic because if you look at the image that's being cast on the wall next to this elderly lady, it really takes on an entirely different feeling. This shadow behind this sort of stooped figure really gives you the impression that it's uh, you know the Grim Reaper creeping up on this woman, or it's the latter part of her life. She's walking towards the light, and the big long shadow falling behind her is in a sense her impending death. I mean, that's one interpretation, but it's a good example of how the quality of the light in the image can radically change your interpretation of that image. And let's go back to this image for a moment because it's a good one to point out that the time of day that you shoot is going to be really important, and that's something that good photographers become very, very aware of. That the quality of light changes throughout the day, and the time that you shoot any assignment for this class, but particularly this class, should be considered not simply because you've got a few extra minutes, but because the quality of the light is going to help you achieve what it is you want to achieve. Um, when the light is lower, when the sun is lower in the sky in the morning or in the evening, it casts longer shadows. So again, we look at this image and obviously the shadow from the woman is very dramatic, but consider that every little crack on that wall and every little brick on that street is also casting a shadow. And the longer a shadow is, the more it's accentuating all those little textures in the walls and the street. And so very often light, early or late in the day is going to give you a much more dramatic effect for the things you're shooting than in the middle of the day when the sun is high in the sky and straight over your head. You're going to get the least amount of shadow, particularly in summer months. The next image is by photographer Paul Strand, and I put in this image particularly to point out another thing which you should keep in mind throughout the course, and that is that each assignment that you do really builds on the previous assignment or assignments, and you shouldn't just disregard the thing that you just learned in the previous assignment. Much better thing to do is to try to incorporate some of the other things that you've learned in assignments into the new assignment. So this is a good example of an image that uses light and shadow effectively, but it's also a good example of an unusual point of view. The next image is by the French photographer Brassai, and this image is a little bit different in that he was using artificial light. He would set up these shots at night. They were taken in Paris in the 1920s, and he would use people that he knew as models, but he was very good at using dramatic light to achieve these effects, and they have a very cinematic quality to them. I think he was very aware of the kind of drama that he could create, and he hung out with a lot of influential writers like Henry Miller, and he liked the idea that he could create these kinds of narrative images that had a lot of drama to them. In this next image, I think it's a really good example of how light and shadow can add meaning. You see this bride standing in this kind of triangle of light looking into this shadow area. So there's a lot of contrasts here. There's shadow, a contrast of light areas and dark areas, but there's also a contrast in meaning where you have a woman in a wedding gown, but looking into this space that's strewn with garbage, and so perhaps add some meaning that perhaps she's having second thoughts about getting married, or um, regrets having just gotten married. And I think this brings up an important way of interpreting images, because I think we're all trained to look at images, especially photographs, in terms of nouns. If photographs are supposed to be factual documents, then we look at them as nouns. So in this image, you would see bride or garbage or billboard. But I think one thing that is really important to do, especially with fine art images, is to start thinking of them in terms of adjectives. So words like regret or foreboding come to mind. So if you can, try to play with images in a way that will do this sort of thing. Early with this next image, it's a photograph by the photographer Gary Winogrand, and you see three young attractive women walking down the street, and this column of light really kind of frames them and makes them look more glamorous. But then off to the left side is this figure that's kind of slumped in a wheelchair, and so it really creates this ironic kind of dichotomy between these people that have everything, and yet there's another figure off to the side that seems to have very little. The light and shadow assignment, obviously dealing with extreme light areas or extreme dark areas. One of the things that you should consider is how you meter this shot with your aperture and shutter speed. In this image, you notice that there are parts of the image that are in shadow, and you can make out the pattern in the tiles on the ground, but then there are other parts of it that are in the very sunny area where it's gotten so bright that you can no longer see that pattern in the tiles. And one of the things that you'll have to consider, and that you should definitely try when you're shooting images for this assignment, is this idea of bracketing. And when I say bracketing, I mean maybe the best thing you can think of as an image are parentheses that go around a word. You have one at the beginning and one at the end. So very often what photographers will do is take three different shots of the same scene, but give emphasis to different parts of that scene. So for example, in the shot with the pillars, the photographer might one time meter the shot so that it's favoring the shadow area. Next time they might meter it so that it favors the really sunny area. And that way you're giving yourself more options when you come back and start editing your images.